Good afternoon, class. It is close to the end of the day here on Tuesday. As promised, I wanted to put together a little video for you in lieu of class tomorrow, the 13th. The reading that we are pulling a couple selections from is Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind. Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist at, I think it's Harvard, maybe NYU. He's been at Harvard. He's a big shot. And this is a slightly older piece now. It's, I think, about 7 years old. Yeah, about 7 years old, but it's still one of his stronger overall, most known books. He came out with one more recently that got a lot of attention. But I wanted to go back and look at The Righteous Mind. Why? Because as we have been doing, we're just looking at stuff that invites us to think a little bit more carefully, I'd say, about some of the assumptions of general semantics in terms of the serious man approach, in terms of language and thought and reason and facts, and this very sort of rigid, objective world that that whole project is steeped in. So I can't spend too much time on this. I got to do some other things here before I head home. So this will be a fairly quick take on it. There's two chapters that we're looking at. One is the first chapter, where does morality come from? And then chapter 7, the moral foundations of politics. I've also posted a link to one of his videos talking about why conservatives and liberals can't get along. It's like 25 minutes, but it's really good. If you're interested in this stuff, check it out. And then another, a little piece in the New York Times on this kind of culture of cynicism and mistrust, which is sort of what we're up to here. So the big reveal, the big news for this reading, this approach today with Haidt is, why are we talking about morality? Talking about the righteous mind, right? Morality is something that we tend to think about as kind of separate from reason, right? Think back probably a couple months ago when I put up on the board, I think it was maybe the Perelman Day, where we did the kind of the fact value split. Remember that column? And, all the things that lined up on the value side were like bodies and passions. And basically that's the intentional world. And then the fact world was like objective, external, and reason and rational and these kinds of things. So we got bodies over there, we got minds over here, and they're separate, right? So there's morality as part of sort of our subjective embodied kind of reality. And then there's reason over there, which is part of the world of facts and objective truths and so on. And what's really powerful about this book, and he's coming at this from a very strict kind of science and social sciencey kind of perspective. So he's doing lab experiments. He's very like data driven, and this is high level stuff. This is pretty reliable, and he is really interested in this kind of relation between how we reason and how we envision morality, right? Questions about morality. And so the big story, the big reveal here is that in fact, our reasoning functions work in the service of our emotionality instead of them being separate, right? So when we think about reason as just dealing with hard facts, it's not that that's wrong, that reason doesn't sort of work with facts and objective stuff and logic and logos and so on. But his thing is that more fundamentally, our reasoning faculties are working in the service of our emotional and moral commitments, right? And that those things are very deep parts of just what it means to be human. So this is kind of mind-blowing. It's a simple kind of point that he makes toward the end of that first chapter in very clear terms. This idea that he calls reason our like press secretary, right? It's basically like we come up with our decision and then reason figures out how to justify our decisions, kind of after the fact, right? So it's like we come up with our policy, and then the press secretary goes out and sells the policy in as reasonable and rational approach as possible. All right. So the reason this becomes important for what we've been talking about, general semantics and so on, is that the presumptions and the premises are basically flipped, right? So the presumptions of general semantics is that we need to try to like set aside our subjective, internal, intentional worlds and see those as always like getting in the way and sort of distorting and crowding out our attempts to be objective and reasonable. And it's not the case, at least as Haidt is saying, it's that's not how it works. We can't separate, right? So reason is always operating in the service of prior emotional and moral convictions. And these come from kind of deep within us and our evolution and our sociality. And so he starts digging into some of those dynamics and those components of how we think of ourselves in relation to one another and what we care about, what we value, and so on. And so we'll just bounce through and look at a couple key moments here. So he starts off the first chapter talking about, doing a little bit of a kind of history of how he came to his research, because it's departing pretty strongly with the traditions that he's identifying. He's noting that, like, when he came into grad school, there are these kind of three approaches. You could talk about morality as being part of our evolutionary biology, sort of just wired into us. We don't have to think about it. It's just there. Another approach says it's learned, right? And then there's this third approach. Those are like the nature-nurture kind of approaches. And then he talks about a third approach, which is rationalist, in the sense that, like, I don't know, somewhere in the middle. We're socialized. We socialize ourselves and we develop our sense of morality in terms of our social adaptation, I guess. And so he's kind of like drilling more down into that tradition. He wants to think about kind of like fundamental human convictions and how they organize our sense of right and wrong and our kind of moral worldview, right? So he spends a decent amount of time kind of developing that story. One thing that I would want to note is how he talks about the relationship between like nature and nurture and sort of what drives what. And he gives this interesting analogy of like a book. Just trying to find it here. Probably should have wrote these pages down. Sorry, it's been a little hectic in the office here today. I'm just trying to do this efficiently here. In any case, I might find it in a moment. But he's talking about how thinking about the relationship like between biology and sociality, or nature and nurture. He talks about our genes, our biology, as being like a draft of a book, right? So we have lots of tendencies, we have lots of possibilities and capacities, but they're kind of drawn in pencil or, lightly. It's like a draft of the way things could go in terms of what we're capable of. But the hard writing of those chapters actually plays out in terms of the specifics of our lives, right? So we can go in this direction, we can go in this direction, and then what actually happens depends on circumstances, basically, right? So that was an interesting approach, that analogy about the book and the draft. Disgust and disrespect. To be honest, the key stuff here in this first chapter kicks in right toward the end. And so this business of inventing victims on page 24 is quite interesting. Second paragraph on the left, he says, I conducted many of the Philadelphia interviews myself, and it was obvious that most of these supposed harms were post hoc fabrications. Asking questions sort of about people's sense of morality by throwing at them these kind of weird scenarios, like disgusting scenarios or scenarios involving disrespect and so on. And then sort of, what do you think about this? Were they right? Were they wrong? What side are you on? And he says people usually combined the actions very quickly. They didn't seem to need much time to decide what they thought. But it often took them a while to come up with a victim, and they usually offered those victims up half-heartedly and almost apologetically. As one subject said, well, I don't know, maybe the woman will feel guilty afterward about throwing out her flag. The example that he gave, the little story, was a woman who has this old American flag, doesn't really need it anymore, doesn't want to throw it out, and actually just like tears it up into strips and uses those strips to like clean the house or whatever. So it's desecrating the flag. What do you feel about that morally, right? And what he noticed is that people said it's wrong in terms of like some sense of right and wrong and morality, but they didn't necessarily have like an immediately strong kind of explanation for who it's wronging or how it's wrong, and so they would revise their explanations to fit in with that moral sensibility, right? And that's the morality reason thing that's quite interesting, is that the reason is kind of always justifying the moral conviction like after the fact, right? So at the bottom of that column he says, yet even when subjects recognized that their victim claims were bogus, so it's got to be hurting this person, it's got to be hurting this person, and the interviewer would like check them like, well, actually, don't forget that no one knows about this. No one knows that this woman tore up this flag, right? Instead, they kept searching for another victim. Like, I know this is wrong. I just got to figure out to who or who is affected. So the next column says, I know it's wrong. I just can't think of a reason why, right? That's really interesting. That means that our emotions, our intuition, our deep-seated feelings about right, wrong, good, bad, and so on are first, and then our justifications, our rationale comes later, right? This really throws up in the air the kind of objective power of facts, right? Because this suggests that like we can take whatever objective reality that we choose to focus on and marshal it in the service of our own particular moral worldview, and this is where our sense of righteousness comes from. So next paragraph he says, these subjects were reasoning. They were working quite hard at reasoning, but it was not reasoning in search of truth. It was reasoning in support of their emotional reactions. I would say that's probably the single most important sentence, if not thought, of this chapter right here, this opening chapter. That's really what he's up to, right? So he's going back and he's saying, David Hume said this a couple hundred years ago. I feel like I've now kind of confirmed this idea that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. I had found evidence for Hume's claim. I had found that moral reasoning was often a servant of moral emotions. And this was a challenge to the rationalist approach that dominated moral psychology. The rational approach is what dominates general semantics too, right? So it's another one of these really tough complications. And he makes really compelling arguments for the fact that ultimately humans, this is more going into that next chapter on politics, that we are tribal, right? We developed in this landscape of groups and communities, and like feeling a sense of connectedness to certain groups and a sense of alienation and difference from other groups and so on. And we use our reasoning to essentially justify those facts and those realities, right? And so just think about how much, whether you're liberal or conservative or left, right, or where you might fall on different questions, and how much of your sense of what is right and therefore what is true is driven by your sense of belonging to a particular kind of tribe or community. So that's a pretty mind-blowing discovery that he made almost 15 years ago. And he finishes these chapters with nice little summaries. So 26, he says, all right, so here's what I did here. He talked about the moral domain varies by culture. It is unusually narrow in Western educated and individualistic cultures, sociocentric cultures. So we often talk about cultures organized around the individualism, right? That's more Western. And then we talk about collectivist cultures, that's more Eastern. And sure enough, you find very different kinds of value systems and sense of right that emanating from these different kind of cultural contexts, right? So does that mean that, morality is relative and that like everything's up for grabs? I don't think so. morality is something that like all cultures have, and there's lots of consistencies across, but there's also particularities, right? That you'll find if you go to different parts of the world or even different parts of the country. Think about the differences between, you know, San Francisco and rural Arkansas, right? Think about the different values and worlds and sense of right and wrong that emanate from those different kinds of places. Um, Next one, people have gut and feelings that can drive their reasoning. Moral reasoning is sometimes a post hoc fabrication. Morality can't be entirely self-constructed by children based on their own growing understanding of harm. Cultural learning or guidance must play a larger role than rationalist theories had given it. Right, so culture matters, psychology matters, and our humanness, our animality, our materiality, our physicality is also, our biology is also a big part of this. So quickly then just jump into the next chapter. 15 minutes, okay, 60 minutes, I'll be quick. This one's great. This is now chapter 7, so he's covered a lot of ground in between these two pieces. But this one I wanted to get on there as well, just because he's talking about politics. And what's great about this piece is the way he comes up with these 5 ways of understanding moral concerns, moral convictions, based on some of the most recurrent, I would call these topoi, moral topoi. And what does he call them? I think in a different part of the book he calls these moral taste buds, right? But he comes up with 5 different kind of moral criteria, or topoi that we all seem to kind of oscillate around, and he does this in terms of sort of this or that. And so the first one is crap. Where's number 1 kick in here? Sorry. Yeah, there it is. The care harm foundation. Yeah, these are foundational morals. Care and harm, right? So this comes out of our need to take care of young, and our feelings of or morality and rightness that swirl around that very basic fact, right? So harming children, terrible. Caring for them, essential. And think about how many things are connected to this, right? So that's important. He says on page 6 there, second paragraph, political parties and interest groups strive to make their concerns become current triggers of your moral modules. To get your vote, your money, or your time, they must activate at least one of your moral foundations. So again, these become sort of rhetorical topoi, which means that these are things that we walk around with that people can tap into, right? Are you more on the, taking care, or are you defending, or are you, actively working towards something or against something? These are the coordinates that determine a lot of that stuff. Page 7 at the beginning, he says, bumper stickers are often tribal badges. They advertise the teams we support, including sports teams, universities, and rock bands. Save Darfur, don't tread on me, support our wounded, right? Care and harm. And what's, these very basic feelings about care and harm, they don't always just have to relate to children, but they have to relate to our sense of what's valuable and what matters most, right? And so they can get deployed in different ways, but we kind of return to these kind of this coin of care and harm, right? Taking care and defending against harm. The second topoi would be fairness and cheating. He says on 8, toward the top, one of the most important insights into the origins of morality is that selfish genes can give rise to generous creatures as long as those creatures are selective in their generosity. So again, we think about fairness matters and cheating matters, and these organize and govern so many of our attitudes about what's right and wrong, right? But again, they can get deployed in all kinds of different ways, and we can use them in even contradictory ways. Like, if we're more liberal or more conservative, we might have very different senses of what is fair and when to be fair and what counts as fairness versus cheating and, what can be considered cheating and when. But these are coordinates that we all kind of hew to that can take on different interpretations, but they're always sort of present in some form. So the left is very interested in the rich paying their fair share of taxes. We hear this a lot lately with billionaires. Like billionaires need to pay their fair share, right? That's something that you'll find more on the left. I like this page on page 9, right before number 3. He says, everyone cares about fairness, but there are two major kinds. Sorry, the screen went dark there. On the left, fairness often implies equality, but on the right, it means proportionality, right? People should be rewarded in proportion to what they contribute, even if that guarantees unequal outcomes. So we all care about fairness, but it can mean different things in different contexts and so on. Nevertheless, those are recurring common moral motifs. Third is the loyalty betrayal foundation. That's a very tribal kind of thing. Donald Trump is someone who cares very much about loyalty, right? It's like, doesn't matter, right or wrong, you got to stick with me. You got to get my back. You got to defend me. Doesn't matter what I say, you got to defend me, right? And this one makes a ton of sense to me in terms of like our political kind of discourse right now, because the left and the right are extremely at odds with one another, and they both sides seem to feel like a really strong sense of righteousness, right? We are right. We have the truth. And there's all kinds of emotion that surrounds these things. And this makes a lot of sense in terms of like how two opposing camps can think of themselves equally as right and true and have completely different worldviews. But ultimately what's going on is you have these sense of like teams, right? This is my team. And if someone's on my team, even if they mess up, doesn't matter, right? We stay with them. We defend them. And, so they might have made a mistake, but they have a larger truth and they have a larger rightness that we are going to defend and protect here. I think that explains a lot of like the inconsistencies that you'll find within the different kind of political sides of the political spectrum, right? There's no actual truth that I can tell, little bits and pieces here and there. But if you're a hardcore liberal or progressive, or if you're a hardcore conservative Republican, you will feel true. You will feel yourself in the true. We have the truth, right? Both sides sort of feel this way. What they do also feel is a sense of kind of moral connectedness to a shared reality, right? And so they're kind of both right and both wrong at the same time. And so they're using their reasoning powers to sort of affirm their sense of moral conviction within the team that they play on. So at the very top of 11, it says, the original trigger for the loyalty foundation is anything that tells you who is a team player and who is a traitor, particularly when your team is fighting with other teams. Because we love tribalism so much, we seek out ways to form groups and teams that can compete just for the fun of competing. So this idea of teams and tribalism, competitiveness, social competitiveness is deep within these moral reasoning processes. Fourth, the authority subversion foundation. This is the business of like where we find ourselves in relation to one another in terms of hierarchies, authorities, who's up, who's down, how we negotiate those relations, right? Do we feel that they're just, unjust? Do we feel like we're being screwed over? There's a sense of propriety or a sense of honor to the system and so on. Typically, the left is less embracing of hierarchies than the right. The right's more about like order and vertical order and, let's follow the leader and do what we say and, more of a kind of militaristic approach. The left tends to be more kind of disconnected and spread out and a lot more kind of infighting on the left than Democrats. And so it's because they have a different idea about authority and leadership and power and so on. So again, you can find very different variations on these themes, but the themes themselves are important organizing powers. And then finally, we get the sanctity and the degradation foundation. Really interesting here too. Just think about whatever side of the political spectrum you might be on. What is sacred and what counts as degrading, right? So as he notes that like the left or the right tends to think about sacredness in terms of the flag, in terms of the nation and rituals surrounding the nation. We just had Veterans Day yesterday. There's a lot of sacredness to the veterans, right? and that whole world of defense and military and soldiers and so on. The left is much less about all that kind of stuff. But the left is very sacred about like the environment and about like voice and rights, and about, again, fairness and equality and so on. So again, these things are deep within us and our sort of social communities, but they change, right? There's variations, and they get sort of worked and reworked in different ways. Oh yeah, immigrants, the immigrant question, right? So that's one that you can find very different moral attitudes about right now in terms of the sacred and the degrading, and the kind of sort of like lines up in terms of opposition perfectly. So that's kind of it. That's sort of how he ends off here. Virginity pledges, right? Chastity, environmentalism, so on. It's really, really interesting. So yeah, so he provides a nice sum, 5 moral foundations. And we find these around us all the time right now. So again, I wanted to go through this just to kind of get a better sense of like where we're at. Because we do not live in a world of general semantics, by far. So how can we account for the world we actually live in? I think this is a really important way of thinking about our political discourse, our communication, how language gets used, how thought takes shape, and especially the kind of the fractiousness, right? So I think it's best that we don't think about like who's right and who's wrong and who's ultimately got it right and who's better and who's worse. But sure enough, we see these very strong sense of tribal communities or political groups or whatever, and they have just different sets of like value orientations. And so they sort of functionally do exist in kind of different worlds than one another. But it doesn't seem to make a ton of sense to kind of decide this in terms of who's ultimately right and who's ultimately wrong. It's more about like what are the components of each side's different kind of worldview, and what do we think about those components, and where do we find ourselves? And he's just providing us with much more kind of descriptive and useful language to talk about some of the problems of public communication today. So all right, so that's already, oh boy, 30 minutes. That's plenty. Let me see here. What else we got going on? I have to get your next paper assignment up. But you guys are still working on your current assignment, so I got a few days there. So in the meantime, just enjoy your week off. Please do the readings. Do please watch this video, and hope you're enjoying your little grocery store clickety. Take your pictures of labels, and looking forward to that conversation. So I'm hitting the airport in the morning, and I'll be in Baltimore for a few days, and I'll catch you guys next Monday. So have good ones, guys.